Hello, grade 12 scholars, it's Miss Novak here, and we are back for week 8, lesson 34 of your ELA Distance Learning. What can we expect from these videos? Well, first, each day is going to be a little bit different. I'll always provide you with a list of materials and resources needed for that lesson. We'll engage in an overview of the different learning components. I'll make my way through a model, particularly if it has to do with writing inside of the lesson before you launch into your independent work. And lastly, we'll preview the next day's learning. This week, we'll be reading a new text entitled My Old Home by Lu Xuan. I believe that's how I pronounce the name. We'll start by reading it tomorrow, but today we'll learn more about the author, some background about the text, and we'll explore some of the vocabulary words we'll encounter during our reading. The link to the video is ELA G12W8L34. We'll be looking at the front-loading material of this text, and we'll engage in a jumpstart and vocabulary activity. We'll also read a little bit about the background, so let's prepare ourselves now. Can you say these reminders right now? I think you can. First, we're going to make sure that we're sharing our learning with someone at home, especially as we're gearing up to actually read the text this week. Next, we'll make sure that we're completing our weekly fluency activity and logging it in our grade 12 packets. And lastly, we'll make sure that we're getting our favorite book out reads. I have mine already ready on my lap here for us to engage in our independent reading activity. And to warm ourselves up for the thinking we'll be engaged with today, let's talk about a riddle of the day. So here it is. The more you take, the more you leave behind. What are they? You need to pause the video here, unless you're one of those people that can get it within 10 seconds or less. I'll reveal the answer in the next slide. And the answer is footsteps. I happen to get this one, which is exciting. I also think that this saying is on a bunch of greeting cards. Am I right? Something about footsteps? Anyways, I'm now ready to launch into lesson 34 with all of you. Materials and resources for today's lesson can be found inside of your grade 12 packet. Of course, lesson 34 is on page 113, note catcher not surprisingly 114. The text is on pages 104 to 112. Yep, it's a little bit longer for us this week, and you'll make sure to have a pencil, pen, or something to write with. You can only write with pencils or pens. Can't write with a highlighter, but it is still good to have one. So gather these materials up and get ready to learn. This week we'll be reading a short story entitled My Old Home by Lu Xuan. It is a first-person narrative of a man who travels back to his old home to move his remaining family closer to his new home. As we read, let's keep the essential question in mind, which is, what does it mean to call a place home? Also, let's make sure that we acknowledge the guiding questions as we read. First, what makes a place important enough to write about? And second, in what ways is home both a place and a state of mind? We'll keep these in mind as we delve into the text, especially tomorrow, and make sure to account for them in our notes and annotations. Today's learning target is, I can define key vocabulary and use my background knowledge to answer questions. Pretty straightforward, if we're willing to put in the work. Let's engage in an overview of the learning. First, you're going to move through a jumpstart activity, which asks you to think back to different lessons you've learned about friendship over the years. Next, you're going to be reading some background information about the author and about the text itself. Following that, you'll discuss what you learned with someone to kind of open up your thinking before you launch into your reading. And lastly, we'll be ending the day with some vocabulary work that you'll of course capture inside of your note catcher. Let's get started. For the thinking component of today's lesson, you'll be asked to capture your response in your note catcher. And the question reads, think about the friends you've had over the past 10 to 15 years, basically your whole lives. What lessons have you learned about friendship? Compared to high school, Was it easier or more difficult to be a good friend in elementary school? I know you have to dig deep for this one, so give yourself some time. Pause the video here and complete this activity in your note catcher. Welcome back after what may have been a pretty charged response. I know it was for me on my end. I learned a lot about friendship in middle school, but even more so in high school. Maybe you find the same. Anyways, let's get back to our tasks. Right now, we're about to launch into reading the About the Author section. We'll read this together. Next, you'll be asked to read the background information about the text. Both of these items can be found on page 104, so make sure to have your packet out and turn to page 104. I'm asking you to circle or underline anything that pops out at you from these paragraphs, such as unfamiliar vocabulary words. I know that I found a couple. Make sure that you're capturing your reactions to the text in the margins. Let's get started. As promised, we're going to read the About the Author section together. So let's turn in our packets to page 104 and follow along. Keep in mind we are annotating as we are reading, and we are also offering a reaction to the text in the margins. So Liu Xin. Look up how to pronounce that name, making sure that I got it right out of respect, is a major figure in 20th century Chinese literature. He wrote short stories, poetry, essays, and literary criticism, both in classical and vernacular Chinese. As a young man, he studied medicine, but quit before receiving his degree in order to devote himself to literature. During the 1930s, Liu was considered for the Nobel Prize in Literature. Also around this time, he renounced the writing of fiction and wrote primarily essays until his death. Interesting. Let's pause the video now, capture some of our annotations, react to the text in the margins, and we'll come back together for a brief discussion. Let me bring you into some of my thinking as I was reading this first little section. So as I was reading, I underlined part of the first sentence that tells me a little bit more about the author, Liu Xin, and where he's from. I find out that he's a Chinese author who wrote in different Chinese dialects, right? In both in classical and vernacular Chinese, meaning the spoken word. At the end of the paragraph, we also learn that the author renounced. How many of us circle that word renounced as something that we have to look up? I did. So he renounced or rejected fiction later in his life. And really, he just stuck to writing nonfiction in the form of essays primarily. I find this very interesting because it's almost like a code switch. Okay, at this stage, I'm no longer going to write in fiction. I wonder what caused this shift in thinking. Since we know that My Old Country is a short story, this must have been written before this decision to switch primarily to essays. Interesting. Next, you'll be reading the background section to learn more about the short story and the times. Pause the video to do this now. Welcome back. I'd like to bring you into my thinking as I was reading the background section of the text, especially because there's a lot of information here for us to digest. I just want to point something out before I start. Notice how I didn't just underline or highlight the words and how I wrote in the margins. I actually did write in the margins, and I just simply typed this up for us here, okay? So first, I need to know the importance of engaging with the text, interacting with the text. That's what this space is there for. Let's get ourselves started. So I noted that in the first sentence, we learned that the story will be exploring the theme of how intellectuals live their lives in China. We know that from our exploration of themes last week that this is a culturally specific theme. It's not universal, right? It actually caters to one specific culture, right? We also learned in the middle of this paragraph that the author illustrates this theme by his description of two characters in the story, the narrator and his childhood friend. This kind of gives me a hint to pay particular attention to these descriptions as I encounter them in the text. And finally, at the end of the paragraph, the author uses the word chasm to describe the difference between the narrator and his friend. Let's be honest, how many of us circled the word chasm to look up and to clarify for ourselves? So just note that a chasm is a deep division or a separation. The author, therefore, will be describing the divide between the narrator, who has become a successful writer, and his childhood friend, who is not so much well-traveled and whose situation really hasn't changed much since they were together as children. Again, this is something that I'll pay special attention to as I'm reading, because it's closely connected to the theme of the story. Let's compare our annotations here before we launch into our next activity. Pause the video now to do just that. For the remainder of the lesson, you will talk and write. The beauty in discussion. For your discussion today, I'd like you to think about what the background section that you just read made you think about. Remember that in the background section, we learned that the story is about two friends who have led completely different lives after childhood. Maybe you want to think about a movie or television show that reminds you of this and talk about this to a family member or friend or a classmate perhaps. After that, you're going to move on to your daily writing. For today, define 2 vocabulary words from the text on your note catcher. These words are desolate and strike. Lastly, I know there's a lot to handle today. Then take a look back at page 104 and in your packet and use a dictionary to look up the words that you circled during your reading. Write these down in your note catcher. Some words you may want to include in this list are chasm, cosmopolitan, and renounce. Just little hints there. After you're done writing, share your jumpstart writing with someone at home. And maybe even ask them to open up about the lessons they've learned about friendship. Take some time, pause the video, and complete all of these steps right now. As always, if you have any questions, feel free to contact your teacher. Their first name, their last name at detroitk12.org. I'm sure they would love to hear from you. We've just completed a really information-heavy lesson, and I'm glad about it because now we have a foundation to launch into our reading tomorrow. And tomorrow's learning target, lesson 35, reads, I can annotate a text and use key details to determine the narrator's feelings. I definitely feel ready for this lesson, especially after the thinking that we did today. Here are a couple of quick reminders before we end today's lesson. First, don't forget to talk about your lesson with someone. This lesson moved into the topic of friendship, which sometimes is an easy topic to discuss. Next, make sure you are reading for 20 minutes, right? Documenting your reading activity in your reading log in the front few pages of your packet. And lastly, fluency practice. Just as a quick review, on Mondays, it's usually a great day to practice and time your reading. You can use a timer on a stopwatch, on your cell phone, on a clock even if you need to. Just make sure that you're timing yourself in your reading speed. You might want to hold off on this till tomorrow when we're actually inside of the text, but even still, it's a good idea. Take some time to relish in this learning and to get yourself ready for tomorrow, lesson 35.